Galley Beggar Press are almost the dictionary definition of an independent publisher that punches above its weight. Directors Sam Jordison and Eloise Millar have seen their publications make the shortlists of the Booker and other literary prizes, crafting a reputation for taking risks where others won't, and duly receiving acclaim when those books reach a wider readership. All of which means that each book of theirs is always worthy of attention. James Clammer is the author of a YA novel, Why I Went Back, but for his adult fiction debut, Insignificance, he drew on his previous work as a plumber to tell the story of 24 extraordinary hours in the life of an ordinary man called Joseph. I sat down with all three of them to discover how they all met and why this is the book. I began by asking Sam Jordison how he had first come across James Clammer's writing.
It was way back in the early history of Galley Beggar Press, and I used to run something called the Singles Club, and the idea was that we would give away a monthly short story as an ebook. When I say give away, I actually mean sell. But it would only cost £1, and it was a way of I hoped bringing subscribers into the website and of discovering exciting new writers. And working on a short story is often a really good way of getting to know a writer. And actually, as it turned out, the Singles Club, logistically, it was really difficult to manage getting out a monthly ebook and selling it for £1. The returns were very slim, and there were all kinds of reasons it didn't work. But the thing it was absolutely fantastic for was getting some writers on our radar. And one of them was James Clammer, who sent in a story called The Cruelner, which was very, very strange, but beautifully written. And every sentence was really carefully measured, and you could really tell from reading it that every comma Jim had placed them with exquisite care, and I enjoyed working on that with him and arguing about a few of those commas, as I remember. And we've stayed in touch ever since. So that would be, I guess, 7 years. I think we've been corresponding. But Jim will be able to tell you the story of the intervening years and the composition of Insignificance. But I think that came to us quite a while ago as well. We've been working on it for a long time, and in fact, it was delayed because of the pandemic. So it should have come out in 2020, but we were really worried about all the shops being closed and it not seeing the light of day and not getting the readership it deserved. So we've held it back. So it's been a long process, really.
And James, what's your recollection of meeting? And can you fill in some of those blanks and tell us how Insignificance came to be?
Yeah, well, the first time that I came across Sam really was when he was writing a weekly column for The Guardian, and he was going through the old Nebula and Hugo Award winners. At the time, I was working in a post room at the University of Brighton, and I'd managed to get this down to such a fine art that I could do the post in an hour and spend the rest of the time online. So I read most of Sam's very good columns about that. And then when I wrote that particular story, The Crew End, that was just when Galley Beggar Press had got going. I immediately kind of picked up on them because they put a book out by somebody who'd been in Daya, and I was interested in Robert Graves, although at the time I was actually too poor to write that, to buy a copy of the book. But I sent a copy of of that story, The Crew End, to Sam there, really just when they were getting going. And I was actually at quite a low point as a writer then because I've been getting a lot of rejections, and fortunately they picked up on it. The story actually of that story is quite interesting. That was a real breakthrough for me, that story, although it's a number of years ago now, because what happened was I actually had I dreamed it, and the next morning I wrote it down in a dream. And I realised that dreams are incredibly boring, really, for other people to read about. So I knew that I had to uh, put some kind of dramatic thread through it. But I had this dream was still hanging over me. So I wrote that story in 3 days. Day one was part one of the story. Day two, I did the second part. Day three, I revised it. Day four, I sent it off to Sam and Ellie, and Miracle and Miracles, they actually liked it, and Hallelujah, they published it in their singles club, and and we've been in touch ever since, as Sam said. Insignificance really comes from my time that I worked as a plumber. Which I did for a number of years. And one of the things that has always baffled me or bemused me since I started reading literature at a very early age was really why this world of work didn't figure in almost any of the stories books that I was reading. Particularly, for example, Evil in War. I went through an Evil in War stage, and Evil in War didn't do much manual labour in his life, and I was being mocked as well at work for reading Brideshead Revisited, and but it wasn't just Evil in War; it was everything else, really, everything that I was reading. Why doesn't? But this, all these writers that I admire, they don't actually ever seem to have had to go out and earn their money for their crust to live. Um, I realised as I went on, and I dug deeper into the structures and the narratives and how drama and stories are put together. Why that is, of course, it's because work is uh, tends to be a very tedious, repetitive thing. It doesn't make for good drama, but still, there is an element that I think this is a huge thing that has been missed out in the writing the experience of novels, because it does tend to be that the people who write novels tend to be middle class or upper class people historically, who have had the time to to develop their skills. So I always thought that this was a gap. Now, when I was working as a plumber, although I wasn't writing at the time, I was always kind of putting these details in the back of my mind. And I knew that really nobody else, or I felt that nobody else had really done this. So one of the things that I did was one day I just sat down and wrote out this um, very technical description of how I'd done this job. And then I thought, this is a kind of new thing, and I'd like to get this into a book, but it took a while to work out how to do it dramatically. I was encouraged by reading some of Rudyard Kipling's short stories. He has an amazing short story where about a steamliner that goes across the Atlantic, and all the parts of the liner come to life. And then I found out as well that Thomas Pynchon had begun his career writing technical manuals. So that gave me a bit of confidence that there was something in there. And so I had, on one hand, I had this technical background, and on the other hand, I had some other ideas that were knocking around about some of the other themes that are in significance, and I put them together, and it seems to have worked. I think, well, the first thing I want to point out, Will, is that I did grow up in a fairly middle class house, so I can't properly present myself as a working class writer. Having said that, I have spent all the jobs that I've ever done have been in that milieu, and
Yeah.
most of the people I know are in that kind of that kind of class. I think there has been a current of working class writing that has gone on really for decades, but has kind of flown under the radar. So you would think, for example, of Alan Sillitoe, who is one of my favourite writers. You would think of John Brain. You would think of James Clammer in Glasgow, who is an incredible writer. I think it's a question of two things. I think this stuff has been bubbling away under the surface all the time, but it gets less. It gets less media, less attention from, say, the book pages. because it doesn't reflect so much the readership of those book pages, and it doesn't reflect also the sales of books, because sad to say, for literary novels, the audience is generally middle class. To become a writer, you need to work at it. It doesn't just happen overnight. You need to put in the hours of um, of perfecting these skills, and you need to read. You need to read, and pick up all the skills and all the tricks other people have learned, and that takes a long time. And most people who have to, what I would call ordinary people, just don't have the time for it. So there's a lot of structural problems to getting these sorts of stories out there.
If you don't have the time or the access to certain things, it means that writing as a career just isn't open to you. I know that there are some efforts underway by some publishers to find writers in communities or in places where they might not see it as an option, and to give them that opportunity. But you, I mean, as you described, you found a job where you basically were able to get the work done quickly so that you would then have the time to do what you really wanted to do, which was
I did. It was a wonderful job, although they got onto me at the end, because they after about 4 years of doing this, somebody came in and said, "Every time I see you, you're reading Dostoevsky." And I said, "I've never read Dostoevsky at work. Thank you very much." I was making my way through James Bond at the time, and eventually they said. They basically cottoned on to it, and they said, "We're going to centralise everything, Jim, through your post room. So you're actually going to be doing work." And at that point, I handed my notice in.
Oh dear, Ellie, I wanted to bring you in now because I wondered if you obviously at Galley Beggar, you are constantly looking for new voices, and you are always looking to find new and exciting literature to bring to readers. And I wondered what it was about Jim's writing, his style, his approach that got you excited when you first read it.
I guess there are two things to say about that. And the first I can say very simply is just that, if anybody who picks up Insignificance and will read it, it's just a wonderful book. And I think on the level of this sentence as well, like, Jim is an incredibly elegant writer, and also that, the narrative and the words themselves are just kind of bubbling with life. So it's immediately thrilling, and, he's just brilliant. And the other thing is, I think at Galley Beggar, I mean, we're not especially wedded to any one particular type of writing, but I think if you look through our backlist, and, Galley Beggar is run by Sam and I, basically, so it's very much our own kind of reading preferences, but we're both quite interested in modernism for a couple of reasons. One, because there was a lot of small presses around then, and two, because there were some brilliant writers. So you've got The Wasteland, you've got Mrs. Dalloway, by Virginia Woolf, you've got Ulysses. And actually quite a few of our books have kind of spoken to modernism and those books. So, for example, whether that's Lucy Alwyn with Ducks Newburyport as a stream of consciousness, or Alex Phoebe with Lucia, which is kind of interrogating the life and legacy of Lucia Joyce. And Insignificance is really part of that, and does something completely different in that I was at a modernist conference a couple of years ago, and I spoke about this because Jim had been talking to me, and it was so compelling that Jim had been talking about those days in the life books like Mrs. Dalloway and Ulysses, and that they were wonderful, fantastic works of literature, but the working class man or woman just never got the chance to navel gaze in literature in the same way. So in a way, kind of Insignificance is Mrs. Dalloway for a working man, and I find that so interesting. So I think it works as a novel in its own right, but I think that it kind of speaks into and out of a particular tradition that I'm quite passionate about.
And Sam, as the other half of Galley Beggar, what was it about Insignificance and James as a writer that got you so excited about bringing this book to readers, especially, as you say, after having had to sort of hold on to it through lockdown and this very tricky year that we've all been through?
I think, of course, I agree with everything my co-director and wife says, of course. And I think, but the other really important thing for me is that it's a great story, and it's really, we've been talking about it in quite intellectual terms, I suppose, now, but actually it's a really emotionally devastating book, I would say. It really. I was gonna. My teenage daughter is gonna hate me saying this, but it's really got all the feels. It really it matters both in your brain, but in your heart. It really wraps its fingers around you, and there's real tension. So, Jim was talking about the plumbing job, which comes quite early on in the narrative, but the description, it's not just that it's fascinating as a description of the way this particular job works. There's real tension because there's a guy sucking on a pipe essentially to get some water flowing, and it becomes just, I was sweating almost.
I've done that job of having to drain a cylinder by sucking it, and it nearly gave me an asthma attack.
Well,
And it was, these things, when they happen in your life, you don't forget them.
And it's really translated onto the page, because you think, oh my God, is he going to be able to do it? Is he going to collapse as a result of sucking so hard on this? And it mounts up and it mounts up in this brilliant way, and it shows you how important these day-to-day things are as well, I suppose. And so all of that stuff really works. And of course it's about relationships and humanity, and the other aspect of the story is a really difficult domestic situation that this guy has with his wife and his son, and it's really touching and it's really moving, and it says really important things about mental health and dealing with really hard stuff.
I'm so pleased that you mentioned the emotion, because I was actually going to come on to that, because I think a lot of people, if they heard that this was a novel about a sort of a working class man who's a plumber, would not expect it to be as emotionally devastating as it is to read, because it's about a man who has suffered a nervous breakdown and is dealing with a huge amount as you're reading this description of his work and what he's doing. And I found it very painful to read, actually. I was so worried about him as a character, and I kept wanting to intervene, but you can't as the reader, of course. You have to sort of sit there and just watch what unfolds. But I just wondered whether for you, James, writing that, as the person who was putting your character through this, whether it was difficult to write, therefore, because it's certainly difficult to read.
Well, this was a strange one, actually, because I have done other writing projects in the past which have been quite they've taken a long time to do. When I came to write this one, I'd come out of a situation in my life where I hadn't actually been able to find the time to write for 3 or 4 months, and it just came out. I wrote it in 121 days, and it wasn't particularly painful to write, because some of those things there were 1 or 2 autobiographical touches in there. So some of these things I dealt with years ago. It just came out in a big rush, and it was amazing, actually, really, the experience of writing it. And when I finished, I thought, I've done it. I've written a novel in 121 days. Of course, then I had to go back through the second draft and smooth out everything, all the pieces that didn't work. But that's just the job. So the experience, to answer your question, Will, it wasn't painful to write. It was almost a pleasure. It just flowed.
To bring in sort of Sam and Ellie again, having received this manuscript that had come out so cathartically, do you think that's also part of the power of what is actually quite a short book, is that it contains almost like a dam that sort of bursts. It's got a lot of energy behind it because it's been contained for so long.
Short answer's definitely yes. I quite like the idea of the dam bursting. It also, I suppose, it feels like being punched in the stomach, but you really feel that force, and yeah, you feel like you've been taken somewhere by the end.
I think as well, it's a book. I mean, we're kind of talking we're being quite binary here in terms of classes and stuff, but in terms of the family dynamic in relationships, there's no reader in the world who hasn't faced a moment of crisis, which has been quite profound to them and quite distressing. And I think that Insignificance encapsulates a moment like that in quite an exquisite way, which is, very easy to identify with.
And whilst, of course, the book is called Insignificance, it doesn't feel in any way insignificant. And I wonder, for you, Ellie, first, why this book feels like a significant publication, and what you hope readers might get from reading it.
I think it's just a great book. And, all of the things I spoke about before, that, it speaks to me in different ways, both kind of formally and emotionally. But maybe that's the thing. I mean, I think that you've got a very small book. I mean, I think it's 170 pages, a typeset, that packs a tremendous emotional punch. But it's also exquisite. I mean, every page there's a sentence that I want to kind of take out. And I don't know if you ever write little notes. You want to remember certain things that have been said in the book. I mean, I feel that with Jim's book very much. So, it's just a joy on all counts.
We should take you into the back room a bit, because we did have the ridiculous discussion about whether calling it Insignificance was saying that the book is insignificant, and whether people would do that. And in the end, we thought, no, it's the right title, and we'll just ride it out.
I didn't know that had happened.
I didn't know that had happened either. So, Sam, you had that conversation with yourself.
Well, I'm pretty sure we spoke about this, darling.
This again feels very fitting for this book, that this is the conversation that we're now having. And James, for you, obviously, as I said, this novel covers some pretty big topics. And often when I speak to writers, they talk about the research that they've done into mental health, or in this case, we might talk about sort of violent pasts, or the British justice system, or something like that. But I wonder whether that was the process for you, or whether it was, as you say, that there was sort of, because of the autobiographical elements, that it was something that you had been holding on to, and that it was about getting it down on the page.
Yeah, so there was the first element, which was the one you've just mentioned, Will, which is the stuff that I had experienced directly. But I'm not really interested in just writing a novel that just touches on that one area of experience. So there are other things in there. There's the stuff about Capgras syndrome. I have a long interest in neurology and mental illness, so that was fascinating. And then I'm also, one of the other things that I am a bit obsessed with is religion. I am an atheist, but I'm fascinated with religion because it's one of the various different world religions, because of these are the ways that people have devised culturally to overcome their own feelings of insignificance and to make sense of their lives. And although these ideas don't really seem to make so much sense to modern people now, maybe in England in the 21st century, they still have got a kind of mythical heft that is incredibly powerful. So that's always been an area of interest for me. And so I love reading about that stuff. And if I can get other stuff like that in as well, then it just adds extra layers. And the more layers you have, the better. And it all adds up to this feeling. It all adds into the theme of significance or insignificance. So there were really there's a whole bunch of things working there. And I'm not really interested in limiting narrative to a tight story. If I can add other things, other layers, other elements, then it all goes in, as long as it works in the end. obviously there are some things you put in and you think, oh, I went off on a tangent there. That really needs to come out. But sometimes that's not the case. So those other aspects were just aspects of what I was trying to multi-layer it with, and I hope I've succeeded with.
And Sam, if you were trying to sort of press a copy of this to a complete stranger in the street, how do you think you would try and sum it up?
This is a thing that as a publisher I should be able to do really easily. And the thing I want to say is it's just it's a really good book, and it's gonna really matter to you. It talks about things that are important. It's about someone you're gonna know, or someone who's in your family, and it's someone who you don't hear from perhaps often enough, but someone who is really important and has weight in the world, and it gives him that dignity and space, and shows just how fascinating his world is, as well as everything else.
Anybody who has a family, who loves somebody and has seen that kind of come a cropper in some sort of way or another, is going to find something in this book. It will also really make you not want to be a plumber. So if you want to kind of know more about
that's why I stopped.
Huge thanks to Sam, Ellie and Jim for taking the time to talk to me about Insignificance, which is out now. Sam and Ellie will both return in an episode of our other series, How We Made, to share the inside story behind one of their landmark publications, the Booker and Orwell Prize shortlisted Ducks Newburyport by Lucy Ellman. In the meantime, the next episode of This Is the Book will be here next week as we talk with Britt Bennett and others about her novel and current Waterstones book of the month, The Vanishing Half. See you then.